Hello and welcome to part 3 of our look at migration and immigration. And here we're going to pick up with our waves of U.S. immigration. Again, we're looking at the historical background of immigration in the United States from the country's establishment in the late 1700s through our current times. Period number 1 was known as the colonial period, and this was a time of voluntary migration from specific European countries and also involuntary migration coming in the form of slavery. During this time, many of our coastal communities, many of our cities, population centers were developed from previous outposts. So during the 13 colonies, the British controlled the what became the 13 states and all the cities along the coast. The image on your screen is from Baltimore in 1815, and Baltimore was an important hub for immigration. Following the War of 1812, so pushing up to 1820, we saw a number of people start to arrive in the United States as the U.S. economy began to grow. Opportunity, primarily in farming, was relatively strong. So you'd have people moving into Baltimore, many of them working in the shipping trade. As you can see, the little hook that goes into the harbor is modern-day Fells Point. So many individuals were working in the shipping trade. Many of them were leaving the port and moving on to farm in the nearby areas. But we saw how these migration streams from places like Britain and France and the Netherlands and Sweden started to establish regular movement across the ocean into the United States. So this time was a time not really of great diversity. We had a population that was primarily Protestant, primarily, again, all right, coming from England or France or the Netherlands or Sweden. So you didn't have a lot of diversity in where people were coming from. The voluntary pool is limited, and then the involuntary, the forced pool, coming primarily from West Africa. When we look again at where these groups were coming from, they set the way for future migration. But then in the second wave, known as the old wave, we began to see people coming from Ireland, coming from Germany. Later on in this wave, we saw immigrants coming from East Asia, primarily China. And this wave was driven by industrialization. So by the mid 1800s, we started to industrialize. We started to create more opportunities in our cities. As we industrialized, we created surplus labor in our farm and our rural areas. So we saw a growth in rural to urban migration during this wave. Again, people migrating internally in the United States from rural areas to our cities, and also our cities serving as a pull factor for immigrants arriving from overseas. In Ireland and Germany during this time, there were some pretty significant push factors. Ireland was going through the potato famine, a time when mass starvation took hold on the island, when the Irish people were under rule of the English crown, and the treatment and the opportunities were very limited in Ireland. So they saw the United States as a place of opportunity. In Germany, we had years of wars going off and on, and there was also some religious persecution taking place. So during this wave, we had the arrival of the Catholic populations, and Catholic populations were met with some resentment. The idea that Catholic people would be more loyal to the Pope in Rome than they would be to any government or any country. So there was a bit of resistance. There was a bit of blowback to these individuals arriving in the United States. Again, ethnically not much different, but there were some religious differences that were picked up on. The Irish came over generally very poor, so there was some class issues that were picked up on. And there, as this period proceeded, there was more and more groups that would organize to counter immigration. So while the need was there, the economic need was there were jobs, there was industrialization, the push and pull factors matched. We started to see the pendulum swing towards xenophobia, and groups like the Know Nothings, their flag shown here, referring to themselves as Native Americans. The irony apparently lost when we look at people coming over and practically wiping out the native population. But we saw the growth of these organizations, and we saw in newspapers Imagery like this, where the Irish and the German immigrants were said to steal the election, right, or throw the election. It's a fake election. It's fraud. It really wasn't the case. But again, that xenophobic view of Irish and German immigrants led to this, right? That the Germans are beer drinkers, the Irish are whiskey drinkers. They can't be trusted. So you think today, you hear some xenophobic rhetoric that might reflect um, this mindset, although the immigrant groups are different. When we looked at immigration policies during this time, the really the only policy was to not be sick. Um, you hear a lot about former groups coming legally, doing it the right way. Well, our immigration laws were very lax. When people arrived in the United States, there was basically a health check. And if you were healthy, you proceeded into the immigration terminal. If you were not healthy, you were set out to pasture, literally. So this graphic on your screen is of Baltimore's harbor. And Fells Point during the old wave, the first part of the old wave, was a primary immigration terminal. Down here on the bottom right is what's called Lazaretto Point. Lazaretto is an Italian word for a sick ward. And that house that you see in the building, this would accommodate individuals that were sick. So as the immigrant boats, the ships came into the port, they would stop at Lazaretto Point. Anybody who was too sick to carry on would be taken off the boat at Lazaretto Point, and the healthy passengers would arrive in the city. Many people simply perished in Lazaretto Point as a result. Today, if you go through this part of Baltimore Harbor, you still see the lighthouse there. This area is very industrial today, but the lighthouse is still a reflection of the immigration past. During this period, particularly the second part of the old wave, Chinese immigration began to grow. The Chinese immigrants met a need for labor. As the gold rush was occurring on the West Coast, as the transcontinental railroad was making its way across the country, there was a great need for labor. And Chinese immigrants matched their their push factors with the pull for work, and they arrived in mass in the United States, primarily along the West Coast. As the Chinese arrived, they started to set up their enclave communities, and they were ultimately treated poorly. As the Chinese populations grew, many individuals who resisted immigration started to call them coolies, meaning that as the supply of labor arrived in the United States, it lowered the wage for native-born Americans. So this idea of coolies means that having the Chinese immigrants arrive in the United States was bad for U.S. labor. It lowered the wage for workers. This early economic resentment led to many different social forms of discrimination. By the 1880s, the politicians acted opposed to Chinese immigration by establishing what became known as the Chinese Exclusion Act. This eliminated Chinese and Chinese American residents' ability to buy property, to own property, to open certain businesses. An image from that time shows Uncle Sam kicking out Chinese laundry workers. Chinese immigrants who weren't working manual labor oftentimes would open laundries or work in domestic service roles. And the resentment grew and grew and grew to the point where policy started to limit the ability for Chinese and Chinese American residents to find jobs, to find places to live. And this act really led to the creation of Chinatowns, because Chinese immigrants and Chinese Americans were not able to buy and own property in other parts of the city, in other parts of the area. So they were confined to the neighborhoods where they originally established their community, and then immigration was shut down. So Chinese immigrants were no longer able to enter the United States. And this existed for over 80 years, until 1965. Again, why certain areas like Chinatown are so insular today because the community was excluded from popular culture for so long. The Chinatowns and the Chinese communities were, again, insular, isolated from the outside communities, even within the same cities. The next wave we'll look at is known as the New Wave. And you can see here this growth in immigration. One of the earlier slides we looked at showed that around 1910, 1920, about 14% or so of the United States population was foreign born. And you can see the swelling during this period of time. What you'll notice, as shown by the arrows, is that the countries of origin began to change. Russia, Italy, Austria-Hungary begin to dominate those migration streams. Where we previously saw in the old wave, Germany and Ireland, we're starting to see different countries now. As Italy began to experience a lot of issues with unemployment and starvation and political collapse, we saw a mass migration out of Italy into the United States. Later on, we saw the collapse of the Russian monarchy and the rise of the Soviet Union led to a great deal of instability and outmigration. So during this period, different groups arrived. Now the groups were arriving from Southern and Eastern Europe, and these groups were seen as exotic, right? There wasn't a lot of Italians or Russians. There wasn't a lot of individuals who spoke these languages, had these complexions, right? It was a different culture, particularly the Slavic cultures. Again, the alphabet was different. The form of Christianity varied. We saw more Orthodox Christians arrive on the scene, and again, this was different. As these immigrants arrived in the United States, they arrived in cities. So where our past immigrant groups would arrive in a city and then move to the rural areas to establish move to the rural areas to work in farming. Some communities would be established in the cities. We saw that this wave carried with it almost an entirely urban population. And this led to a population explosion. The population exploded during this time as immigrants arrived in our cities, and then they carried with them families, and then they had higher fertility rates. So the U.S. population exploded at this time through immigration and natural increase. And during this time is when a lot of our ethnic enclaves were established. Many of these ethnic enclaves persist today in Little Italies, in some Polish or Slavic communities that still exist in a lot of our port cities. And then at the end of this, we see a contraction. We see a time when immigration was pinched, so to speak. And this was done for a couple reasons. One, we started to enter the Great Depression, so that economic pull factor was lost. But the biggest reason why we had this pinch was because of policy. A policy that we'll look at here in just a moment. But during the New Wave, we had scenes like this in Locust Point. This is right where next to Fort McHenry in Baltimore City, one of the major immigration terminals in the United States, second behind only Ellis Island for decades. Another image like this came from Lower Manhattan, and you can see the image on the right, all of the young men. Again, migration selectivity tells us that our migrants are generally going to be younger and moving for economic reasons. So in Lower Manhattan, we had a lot of young men move into these tenements. It became a scene of criticism, a scene of hostility, a time when, images like this were the cause of these people that were arriving in the United States looking for work, that they are inherently flawed and this is how they live, not a result of lack of finances or lack of economic opportunity. So this era, this wave ended through policy, the Johnson-Reed Act of 1924. The Johnson-Reed Act established immigration quotas, which severely limited the ability for immigrants to arrive in the United States. And we'll pick up with quotas in our next segment.